Mud rained down in scalding clumps, turning the trench into a grave. Julian didn't flinch. He just pressed his back harder against the shattered chest plate of Warlord Rena, the bio-weave fabricator whining in his blood-slicked hands. Above them, the sky tore itself apart with artillery fire. The universe's fiercest warlord had needed a medic. She found a shield instead. Julian tasted copper and ash, holding the fabricator steady over her open wounds while the ground shook them to pieces. It turned out, bringing bandages to a plasma fight was the easiest way to get killed. But Terran's sanctuary didn't deal in plasma anymore. Months earlier, Julian had boarded an unmarked, blindingly white medical cruiser, watching the rebuilt green oceans of his homeworld shrink into a pale dot against the black. If humanity had finally learned the true cost of war, they stopped making bullets and started making gauze. The Terran fleets deployed massive medical outposts across the most violent, active galactic war zones, operating with terrifying vulnerability. No railguns, no torpedoes, no planetary defense grids back home, just drop ships descending into the meat grinders of 100 different species. Then the Thraki Ascendancy launched their massive planetary assault on Chorus 9. The entire sector went feral. A multi-species conflict ignited overnight, dragging every neighboring system into a localized apocalypse. Julian deployed straight into the center of it. The drop pod doors blew open, and he hit the pulverized dirt running. The fighting was close quarters and completely indiscriminate. Artillery shells cracked the air, turning the dirt into flying shrapnel. Julian kept his head down, his lungs burning with inhaled soot, scanning the carnage for the living. The heat from the plasma bursts was close enough to singe his eyelashes. He found her pinned under the jagged remains of a crashed transport. Warlord Rena was a terrifying sight even when dying. A towering predator from a warrior caste bred entirely for conquest, currently missing a massive chunk of her lower abdomen. Blue blood pooled beneath her in the trench. When Julian slid in beside her, she bared her teeth, swatting at him with a trembling armored hand. She expected an enemy. She expected an execution. She didn't expect a human carrying a medkit. Julian ignored the threat. He dropped to his knees in the mud, slamming the bio-weave fabricator into the horrific wound. The machine bit in, and its tiny needles anchoring to her torn flesh. Rena let out a choked snarl, her eyes wide with shock. A human was too fragile for this deep in the perimeter. A human shouldn't be here. "Hold still," Julian rasped, his voice cracking from the smoke. The warning siren of an incoming strike cut through the chaos, a shrieking whistle that promised immediate annihilation. There was no time to drag her to cover. There was no time to run. Julian threw himself over her entirely. He used his own body to cap the blast radius, shielding her exposed organs and the delicate fabricator. The shell hit 20 yards away. The shock wave cracked 2 of his ribs instantly. Julian bit through his lip to keep from screaming. The ambient heat seared the back of his neck, melting the outer layers of his suit. Dirt and metal rained down, burying them in a shallow, suffocating tomb. But his hands never left the fabricator. He kept the machine running, forcing his thumbs down on the manual override. It hummed against her skin, frantically knitting artificial flesh and nerve endings together while the world above tried to turn them both to ash. Truth is, Rena stopped breathing for a full 20 seconds. Julian didn't. He poured every ounce of power the portable battery had left into keeping her heart beating. He closed his eyes, ignoring the warm blood running down his own face, and just focused on the steady vibration of the machine. And then, underneath him, the warlord's massive hand snapped up, It didn't strike him. Her thick fingers wrapped tight around his shoulder, pulling him down an inch further into the mud before the next wave of shrapnel flew overhead. The fabricator's indicator light finally snapped from amber to green. The high-pitched whine died. Julian slumped backward, his broken ribs grinding together with a sickening crunch that stole his breath. He waited for the end. Instead, Rena moved. The Warlord sat up, the newly fused bio-weave stretching taut over her abdomen. It held firm. Heavy boot steps pounded above them. Thraki shock troops breached the trench line, weapons leveled to finish the job. Julian tried to push himself up, but his arms shook too violently. But Rena didn't retreat. She stepped entirely over him. She ripped a heavy repeater from a dead soldier's grip and fired. The recoil shook the dirt from the trench walls. She didn't stop pulling the trigger until the perimeter was silent. She had found her medic, and now she became the shield. The extraction zone was 2 miles away through burning terrain. She walked him the whole way. Every time Julian's knees buckled, her massive armored hand caught him, dragging him upright. A silent, bruising escort all the way to the ramp of his blindingly white medical shuttle. 14 months later, Terran's sanctuary sat quiet and green in the deep dark. Then the vacuum tore open. A radical extremist armada ripped out of hyperspace, their engines burning hot and erratic. Hundreds of angular, brutalized ships moved into high orbit. They locked planetary bombardment weapons directly onto the defenseless population centers below. Alarms screamed across the Terran orbital medical stations. The Terran planetary defense grid remained offline because it simply didn't exist. Instead, the stations broadcast a looping, the open-channel transmission across all frequencies. A calm, terrifying refusal to engage. They offered medical aid to the attackers, even as the enemy cannons charged. They prepared to burn. But when the unarmed planet was targeted, the rest of the universe drew its swords. Space didn't just tear, it shattered. Rena's dreadnought, a massive, jagged mountain of black armor, dropped into the sector with a gravitational boom that scrambled the extremists' targeting locks. And she wasn't alone. Thousands of warships followed, rival alien factions, empires that had spent centuries gutting each other over mining rights. Warped into tight formation, they stood shoulder to shoulder, a wall of bristling weaponry shielding the fragile white medical stations. They didn't broadcast demands. They didn't ask for surrender. They just opened fire. The extremist armada was annihilated in a blinding crossfire of unified, impossible rage. The wreckage cooled, but the Allied alien coalition didn't leave. They formed a permanent, ironclad defensive blockade around the Terran system, a ring of apex predators guarding a quiet nest. Down in the primary medical bay of Station Prime, Julian was taping up his own sprained wrist when the heavy blast doors hissed open. He expected a rush of casualties. Instead, Warlord Rena stepped through. She wore ceremonial armor, polished and scarred. Behind her, dozens of rival alien military commanders filed into the sterile white room. Beings who would normally tear each other's throats out stood shoulder to shoulder. None carried weapons. They stopped in front of Julian and snapped to perfect, rigid attention. Rena looked down at him. She stared at the faint burn scar on his neck, then slammed a massive fist over her primary heart. A synchronized, thunderous military salute cracked through the silent ward. "Vitae," Rena rumbled. The title hung in the air, heavier than any crown. It turned out, in a galaxy defined by conquest, the highest rank is the one who stops the bleeding.